Harvesting your plants isn't finished until your herbal plants and herbal preparations are stored in proper containers and put away for long-term storage. It's a lot of work to dry and harvest plants, so it's important that we store them in the best possible way. Because we're harvesting our plants directly from our gardens, they're brimming with life force, and we want to capture that light and green energy. The enemies of storing herbal preparations are heat, light, air, time, and moisture. The best storage containers are glass containers. I now use different size canning jars to store my dry herbs and other herbal preparations. In the past, I used to recycle all my glass jars, and I ended up with all sorts of weird sizes, and I could never find the right tops that fit all those sizes. Canning jars come in a variety of sizes, and best of all, the tops are uniform. The tops of the jar come in small mouth and large mouth. I tend to use the wider mouth jars the most. Make sure when you buy the half-gallon sizes, you buy them in the large mouth because it's a lot easier to load the jars. It's best to completely fill the jars and the bottles to the top to prevent air spoilage for long-term storage. It's also good to have a variety of different size glass jars on hand so that you can find an appropriate size container. Canning lids fit tight, which is an added bonus in preserving the freshness of your plants. And they're also leak proof, which is especially important if you have to transport a liquid preparation. I use canning jars for everything, so I've saved myself a great deal of time keeping things uniform. The small sizes stack up very well on top of each other. You want to store dried plants in small pieces, especially roots. Grinding up the leaves or seeds into powder exposes the plant to oxidation, so it's best to store them in what they call a cut and sifted form, and then grind up the herbs later when you want to use them in powdered form. Some of the herbal elders that I knew would store their leaves whole in paper bags until they needed to use them because they felt they kept better that way. When I first started harvesting plants, I had very little room to store big glass jars in my house, so I used to put the jars in a big plastic container and store them in my garage. I forgot about them one year, and when I opened the jars after 2 years, I was amazed at how fresh the dried plants were. I had harvested them right from the garden, in the dark, away from the light, heat, in a fully packed jar with no headroom, unopened since I put them away. The plants stayed fresh as the day I put them away. The color, smell, taste, and the feel of the plants were full of life and vitality. I store the glass jars inside a small cabinet in my basement. The jars stay in the dark and it's cool in the basement. I do tend to use an assortment of clear jars to store herbal oils and tinctures. Storing them in a cabinet is important so they're away from the light and the heat. Herbal plants and herbal preparations have a shelf life. I was taught that leaves and flowers lasted 1 year and roots and barks lasted 2 to 3 years. I have since found that if stored properly, leaves and flowers will last 2 years or longer. Roots and barks can last more than 3 years. I usually use my dried herbs within a couple of years, so it's important to record the harvest date on your bottles. As you can see with these bottles of calendula flowers from different years, the color has faded in 3 years, so time is definitely a factor. Some plants have a longer shelf life than others. Yarrow, for instance, lasts a longer time. I usually use older herbs for baths and steams and use the herbs from that year's harvest for my teas and other preparations. I use amber bottles to store my tinctures and liniments. They come in a variety of sizes. I will store the bulk of the tinctures in the 8-ounce jars and then transfer the different tinctures into the 1 or 2-ounce bottles with droppers. The small bottles are much easier to store in the kitchen cabinet. Tinctures made from alcohol last many years. Don't go overboard and make quarts of tinctures unless your household will use them. I used to make quarts of echinacea tincture years ago because I supplied a lot of friends and family. And now I teach people to make their own, which is a good thing because echinacea grows everywhere and the price of a 1-ounce bottle of tincture is quite expensive now, and you could easily go through a 1-ounce bottle during the cold and flu season. I store my oils and salves in glass bottles, which I store inside a cabinet in my basement. As with the tinctures, I store the majority of the oils in big jars and transfer what I will use into smaller jars. Herbal oils keep very well in the cool and the dark. I keep some oils for 3 to 4 years. You can smell if they go rancid. Stored properly, they'll keep for a long time. Interestingly, when you turn the oils into a salve preparation, they quickly lose their color after about a year. I noticed this when making green salves, so only make a small amount of salve. Make sure you label everything, and label things immediately because most dried herbs look alike. I cannot tell you how many times I've had to throw away a mixture because I did not label it, and I was sure that I'd remember the combinations, but I never did. It's important to stay small when picking and harvesting herbal plants for later use. We tend to overdo things and harvest way more than we really need. One of the hardest things to do is to compost old herbs that you have lovingly collected and harvested because they were too old to use. Remember, fresh is best, and the plants come up every year.